Christmas Eve in Salem is supposed to mean warmth, family, forgiveness, a pause in the chaos. But this year, something is deeply wrong. Because instead of comfort, Christmas Eve becomes a pressure point, and at the center of it all is a child who is quietly unraveling. Rachel Black. Not with violence, not with screaming chaos, but with something far more unsettling. Emotional collapse. Tonight, we're not just breaking down what happened. We're asking why it matters, and why this Christmas Eve could change Rachel's story forever. For most people, Christmas Eve is symbolic. It represents warmth, belonging, tradition. It's the night where you're supposed to be exactly where you belong, surrounded by family, wrapped in familiarity, reassured that you are not alone. But for Rachel, Christmas Eve represents something very different. It represents absence. It highlights everything she doesn't have and everything she fears she may never get back. When Rachel learns that she will remain at Bayview through Christmas, the impact is immediate. Not loud, not dramatic, but devastating. What matters most isn't the news itself. It's how Rachel responds to it. She doesn't argue. She doesn't plead. She doesn't demand an explanation. She collapses inward. That response tells us something crucial. Rachel isn't reacting to disappointment. She's reacting to rejection. To a child already carrying emotional trauma, Christmas isn't about presents or celebrations. It's about confirmation. Confirmation that you belong. Or confirmation that you don't. And in Rachel's mind, staying behind at Bayview feels like proof of something deeply painful. That she is different. That she is broken. That she is the reason everyone else's life keeps getting disrupted. Christmas Eve doesn't bring her comfort. It strips away distraction. And in that silence, Rachel's deepest fear surfaces. What if this is who I am now? Brady and Tate respond exactly the way loving family members are supposed to. They don't hesitate. They don't pull away. They show up. They sit with Rachel. They stay present. They reassure her that she is loved, that she isn't being punished, that she isn't being abandoned. They say all the right things. And yet, it isn't enough. Not because they're failing her, but because trauma doesn't respond to reassurance. Rachel hears their words, but she doesn't feel them. Because trauma doesn't process logic. It processes emotion. And emotionally, Rachel feels trapped. Trapped in a place that constantly reminds her she's not okay. Trapped in a system that decides when she's allowed to feel normal again. Trapped during a holiday that magnifies every feeling of separation and loss. Brady and Tate are focused on protection. But protection is not the same as empowerment. Rachel doesn't feel like an active participant in her own healing. She feels managed, contained, decided for. And that distinction matters more than anyone realizes. Because when a child feels powerless, they don't immediately rebel. They internalize. They observe. They begin looking for control wherever it's offered. Powerlessness is not just a feeling. It's an opening. This is where the storyline turns quietly dangerous. Rachel isn't just sad. She's isolated. And isolation doesn't always look like being physically alone. Sometimes it looks like being surrounded by people who care, but don't truly understand your fear. Rachel feels misunderstood, overmonitored, quietly judged, even if no one intends it that way. And isolation creates vulnerability. Not all at once, but gradually. Because when someone feels unheard, they stop trying to explain themselves. They start searching for the person who listens without correcting them, the person who validates their pain instead of managing it. This is why the absence of Sophia Choi in these scenes is actually more powerful than her presence. Sophia doesn't need to appear on screen. Her role is already established. She represents comfort without boundaries, understanding without accountability, validation without guidance. And in Rachel's fragile emotional state, that kind of attention becomes incredibly tempting. This isn't speculation, it's pattern recognition. Days of Our Lives has told this story before, again and again. Isolation leads to influence. Influence leads to dependency. Dependency leads to choices that spiral out of control. Rachel isn't plotting, she isn't scheming, but she is learning something dangerous. Who listens and who decides for her? And that lesson will shape what happens next. Christmas Eve doesn't cause Rachel's breakdown. It exposes it. This night strips away routine, the schedules, the therapy sessions, the distractions that normally keep difficult emotions contained. What remains is raw feeling, heightened emotion, magnified loss, unavoidable comparison. Christmas Eve becomes a mirror, and Rachel is forced to look at herself without protection. And in that moment, she confronts a question no child should ever have to face. What if this is who I am now? That question is devastating, precisely because Rachel is still a child. Adults understand that pain can be temporary. Children don't. Children don't see chapters, they see identities. Rachel isn't thinking, I'm struggling right now. She's thinking, this is who I've become. And once that belief takes hold, everything begins to shift. Behavior changes, hope narrows, trust weakens. The world starts to feel less stable, and authority figures feel less reliable. Christmas Eve doesn't spiral into chaos because Rachel explodes outward. It turns chaotic because something inside her quietly fractures. A sense of self, a belief in recovery, a feeling that things will ever go back to normal. And that internal break is far more dangerous than any visible outburst. Every adult surrounding Rachel is acting from the same place: concern. They want to keep her safe. They want to prevent further harm. They want to protect her from herself and from the world. And that instinct makes sense. But safety without agency comes at a cost. Rachel doesn't feel like an active participant in her own healing. She feels managed, observed, scheduled, decided for. Decisions are made about her well-being, rarely with her input. And that imbalance matters more than anyone realizes. Because when children feel unheard, they don't immediately rebel. They retreat. They become quieter, more observant, more selective about who they trust. They start paying attention to who listens and who controls. Rachel isn't plotting, she isn't manipulating, but she is learning something essential: where power exists and where it doesn't. And when a child feels powerless, they naturally gravitate toward anyone who offers even the illusion of control. That lesson, learned quietly, will shape Rachel's next choices far more than any rule or restriction ever could. This storyline is unsettling because it refuses to rely on spectacle. There's no immediate danger, no explosive confrontation, no dramatic turning point that screams for attention. Instead, there is erosion. Slow, subtle, relentless. Rachel's breakdown isn't loud. It's incremental. A little more withdrawal, a little more distrust, a little less openness, and gradually a little more dependence on the wrong kind of influence. That's what makes this storyline so frightening, because emotional erosion doesn't announce itself. It builds beneath the surface, unnoticed until the consequences are impossible to ignore. This is how tragedies often begin in Salem. Not with chaos, not with violence, but with silence. With the moment a child stops believing adults truly understand her. With the moment she starts listening to someone who makes her feel seen, even if that guidance leads her somewhere dangerous. Christmas Eve didn't end with disaster. It planted the conditions for one. And that makes what comes next far more unsettling than anything we've seen so far. So what does this episode actually accomplish? It doesn't deliver immediate fallout. It repositions Rachel's entire trajectory. Christmas Eve becomes the invisible line between who Rachel was and who she may become next. Until now, Rachel's struggles could be framed as sadness, as fear, as confusion. But this episode pushes her somewhere darker, from sadness into despair, from vulnerability into susceptibility. That shift matters because sadness seeks comfort, despair seeks escape. And for the first time, Rachel stops believing that the adults around her have all the answers, not because they don't care, but because their solutions no longer feel like hers. Christmas Eve marks the moment Rachel begins to internalize a dangerous idea. If no one understands what I'm feeling, maybe I need to find my own way out. That belief doesn't immediately lead to rebellion. It leads to openness. Openness to influence. Openness to guidance from the wrong source. And that's where everything becomes uncertain. Because Rachel's next step won't be defined by rules or restrictions. It will be defined by who reaches her first, who listens without correcting, who validates without controlling, who offers understanding without boundaries. And depending on who that person is, everything could change. Christmas Eve turns chaotic in Salem, not because of visible destruction, but because of an internal shift no one fully notices in time. Nothing explodes on screen, no disaster unfolds, but something fundamental changes inside Rachel. This episode doesn't hand viewers consequences. It hands them warning signs. And Days of Our Lives fans know exactly how dangerous those are. Because in Salem, emotional wounds don't fade quietly. They deepen. They distort perception. They drive choices that can't be undone. So the real question isn't whether Christmas Eve was chaotic. The real question is, what does Rachel do next? Because when a child feels unheard, and someone finally makes her feel seen, the outcome depends entirely on who is listening. And if the wrong voice reaches her first, the fallout isn't just possible. It's inevitable. And it's coming.